Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fullest podcast. I'm your host, Nikki Bostwick, and today's guest is Zach Bush, MD, who is a renowned multidisciplinary physician of internal medicine, endocrinology, hospice care, and internationally recognized educator on the microbiome as it relates to human health, soil health, food systems, and a regenerative future. Hi, Dr. Zach. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I know you're such a busy man, and I'm constantly inspired by you and your capacity to hold space. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us. So I was just saying this to you. I've listened to so many of your podcasts over the last month, and I'm consistently inspired by your wisdom. And I know it comes from so many years of experience and trusting your own intuition. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about you. I had the pleasure of meeting you last summer, and then you were so generous to take my son on as a client of yours. And I know that at this point in your career, you're still a practicing physician, but probably don't see any new patients. So that was a really big deal for us. And as soon as I stepped into your office, like the floodgates like came out because I just felt so supported, and it was really a reminder to me to know that I'm supported and the universe supports us. And so that was a really beautiful experience that I was so happy to have with you and to have that with my family. But I know that you have I knew you had a bunch of businesses, but I at some point was, like, outside the Seraphic building. I found myself there, and I realized you have 12 businesses. I know you're a dad. You have the M Clinic still where you're practicing, and I've, heard you recently talk about this fund that you've started that I'm really excited to learn more about as well. So I know that your life hasn't been linear, but obviously looking back, it just looks like it's just gone in this perfect path. But as we all know, like there are just so many steps along the way. And I heard you talking about your experience like post 2008 economic collapse, and also just I heard you talk about like yeah your experience with acupuncture, and I know that you mentioned to me a little bit about your mom. So I'm just curious, like what how is it like growing up? What was childhood Zach like?
I think in some ways I was, really predictable kid. I was very much the kind of quiet kid in the classroom. I always had like one best friend, and kind of squirreled away in my life, away from the mainstream of the attention of the class. My teachers usually liked me because I was diligent, but out of the way. And so it was the kind of thing where I kind of cruised through as a B plus student, kind of underneath the surface. I remember on graduation day from high school, a kid came up and introduced himself, and I said, I know my locker is like 5 lockers down from you, and he's like, I don't think I've ever seen you. And that was like indicative of, I think, of my entire, K through 12 experiences. I went through life kind of unseen and I had my core group of friends, which were a phenomenal group that I grew up with in junior high school, and into adulthood. Still have many of those same friends. So I lived a kind of a small life in those initial years and felt like I was destined for some sort of, labor and specialty with my hands. I was a mechanic and loved rebuilding classic cars, and uh, my first jobs were on construction sites doing cleanup of construction, pushing a broom or washing out toxic stuff from houses or whatever, and then moving on into the construction field and landscaping, and got into uh, the concept of engineering as a potential direction for myself. And so that was kind of how it began, and then was highly disrupted by a trip to the Philippines. I decided to take a year off before going to my engineering program at the University of Colorado, and ended up with a group of midwives birthing babies over in the Philippines, and lived there for 6 months near the squats and outside of Manila. And it was a total reorientation to, a kid who grew up in pretty humble beginnings. I was a couple hippie parents and grew up outside of Boulder, Colorado, and in the housing projects that were outside of Boulder there. And, so pretty humble background, but I had never seen real poverty, and had never been exposed to that. And so it was eye-opening on really deep levels, beyond the medical exposure that happened during that time. It was kind of reorientation of what it, what is the privilege of being an American, and how is America exploiting, indigenous peoples all over the world for the wealth that we enjoy. And just kind of really set my career in a much different direction. And so all the companies that you're getting a glimpse of are all targeting, how do we imagine a future where there's not exploitation anymore? There's no need for it, because we've learned regenerative mechanisms of economy where there's so much energy and so much wealth and value to be shared at the local level, that we don't need to build global supply chains for extracting wealth and resources from all over the world to move into these empires. And instead, we can start reorienting our own communities towards wealth and resilience through regenerative economies, agriculture, economics, education. These regenerative systems will allow us to kind of break down that exploitive humanitarian crisis that we have been a part of. So that's, in a nutshell, the arc of a career and the beginnings.
So you were planning on being an engineer, and then that trip, I think you had mentioned in another podcast, it was with your aunt.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
My aunt had been living in Manila for 13 years, and had really helped form this group. Our weekly clinic and a lot of our daily services
Wow.
were provided through the home that she lived in, and all of that. And so we would have 20 to 30 Filipino women with their newborn babies every week, and I was put in charge of the newborn screenings and stuff like that. And so having these women hand me these tiny infants, many of them born premature and a lot of them malnourished. So you're holding, 4-pound babies on a routine basis, and you're a 19-year-old kid who's never no medical background at all. It was just dumbfounding that this mysterious thing that we call, the physician patient relationship was so powerful that it would allow people to share these most exquisite, most vulnerable moments and trust one another. And so after that experience, it was very hard to imagine going back to, putting my energy into sheets of metal or
Yeah.
robotics and all of that. The human experience was so raw and so real, and I couldn't let go of it after that. I didn't, of course, decide I was going to be a doctor on the spot. I thought maybe I'd be a nurse, and then maybe a nurse practitioner. And I wasn't my sister was like the brains of my family. As that was the identity I had, at least for it. She always aced everything, and her SAT scores blew mine away and all that. So I never identified myself as a super smart person or anything. But I'm kind of steady on. I once I decide I'm going to go on a path, I don't mind a bunch of failure on the way. I just assume that's the learning curve, I guess. And
Yeah.
so that's been my pattern, is to kind of stick with it and keep after where you think you're supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful, piece of advice, because I think that's for the majority of us, we're not acing everything. My sister's the same, she's a genius, so I have that same experience. But I know you had mentioned to me that your mom had some sort of, is it like some sort of condition? And I was curious if that also had anything to do with, like, maybe later on inspiring you to go down the medical route.
Yeah, I think my mother had a seizure disorder when I was growing up, and she was such a great mom. Despite the health challenges that were there, she was so good at creating freedom in our lives. She had 4 wonderful kids, and I've got just the greatest siblings. And she's the most extraordinary mom. But being a kid around parents that have health challenges, it creates a sense of, well, there's a sense of vulnerability there on one hand, I suppose, but I didn't sense that as a child. I really instead sensed this depth of experience, I guess. Like it was not difficult to understand how, as a kid, that the best thing to do with somebody who's having a seizure is sit with them peacefully and just hold their hand, or put your hand on their back or whatever it is, and just wait for the seizure to get over. Like, you don't try to intervene as a child, you just be present. And kids are so good at being present. And when
Yeah.
in those few times that she would have a seizure in public, which was rare, if I just sat there with her, I could see that impact the people around me. The adults that were kind of trying not to freak out around me found a lot more peace if I would just be peaceful. So the way that I dealt with that was just like settle down and be present. And to this day, I was in a public place just recently, and somebody had a seizure that I wasn't related to them at all, but I just sat down with this guy and just patted his back while he had his seizure, and I didn't try to do anything to him or anything else. Like, just be really present, and it takes you back to that moment, of realizing it. And I think the most influence in hindsight that my mom, not only my mom's, but other people around me, health journeys is that the pharmaceutical industry didn't have solutions. Like, they had band-aids. And then she ended up being healed through an amazing event of just, prayer and spiritual intervention and all of this. And
Wow.
so it's just, it planted seeds that, we are being told a very small part of the reality we're living in. And for myself, I've, been through health, you know, crises. I've been through social crises. I've been through loss and of family, and went through a divorce, and I've been through a lot of unexpected losses. That in the end, I find that any of those stressors, any of those things that we think of as vulnerabilities, are actually life's way of making us the strong person we need to become. And it's the strength that we find out of those crises that would define us. And so, in the end, I think that whether we point to a mother's health journey or a child's health journey, or my my grandfather's situation, with his health journey, like any of these experiences in my life, I think that we need to reorder our mindset on those. And that wasn't a health disorder that my mother had. That was a gift. She was gifted with this thing that changed the way our family lived. She couldn't drive during that time, so I grew up biking, which was such a gift. And so I learned how to ride a bike at a really young age. At like 4 years old, I was riding a bike so I could keep up with my mom around town, because my little sister needed to be in the bike seat behind my mom on her bike, and so I needed to learn how to get on a bike and ride. And so that was a gift to our whole family. And so I think we probably really need to challenge, our current social definitions of disorders and disease or whatever, and start to realize this is ways in which life reorients us to what's important. And if you and your son hadn't been on the health journey you guys have been in since he was born, you guys wouldn't have reorganized your family, and you probably wouldn't have this podcast, and you wouldn't be doing your highest purpose. And
Yeah.
so, should we even call these disorders or diseases? And perhaps nowhere more obvious is COVID. Here's
Mhm.
here's something we've termed a pandemic. Viruses are in fact a completely normal part of biology, and when we have unhealthy states of human lifestyles and inner city environments and poor immune systems, these viruses happen more and more often, but not to attack us, but instead to change the direction of our lives. And as a society, we have the opportunity to change the direction away from our, catastrophic treatment of nature that leads to these vulnerabilities of viruses, to an opportunity to really re-engage nature. And so my mother's taught us that, and she taught us a love for the outdoors. I grew up hiking and snowshoeing and skiing with my family, and my mother was always driving us to the next highest peak to get to the top of the mountain. And my mother's one of the strongest, toughest, people I've ever met, and she's so beautiful in her love for nature. She's one of the most, fantastic gardeners I've ever known. Her property in Virginia is like a botanic gardens experience, just to go over for dinner. It's just like she has any hardships that come her way, she's been so good at turning it around into something really beautiful, and taking the opportunity when directions need to change to do something even bigger with her life. And She and I graduated together on the same day from the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center,
Oh
and so
my God.
she graduated with her nursing degree, and I graduated with my MD in the same ceremony, which was such a victory for both of us. She had raised 4 kids. She had been, by this time was extremely healthy, and went on to have a great nursing career, doing hospital nursing and then hospice nursing, and then I actually got to be a medical director at the hospice that she had done her hospice nursing at. Like there was just so many cool overlaps between our careers in the years that followed, and so I give huge credit to my mother's resiliency and her way of always finding a brighter path for herself and her family that always kept us reconnected to nature and nowhere more true than our food. She was an incredible cook and made sure that everybody entering our home, which was always an open home, we always had guests multiple times a week, and we often had international students or families living with us. Despite the humble homes we lived in, we had always people at the dinner table eating my mom's incredible food, and so I learned that food was not just medicine, but was a real epicenter for social and spiritual fellowship to happen as well. And so, these are the journeys that you have with one human being, one mother. And I'm just inspired by all the moms on this podcast to think about the ways in which you've reorganized your life and the lifestyle of your family around the health challenges that your kids are seeing or you're seeing in your own life. So many of you are trying to support sick children in the midst of the highest level of chronic disease that your generation has also seen. So you've got autoimmune disorders and chronic fatigue and chronic brain fog and all this, and you're managing the sickest child's population, that we've ever had in human history, despite your own health challenges. And so I would just offer the opportunity for all of us to take a deep breath and reframe our perspective for a moment to say these aren't health crises, these aren't sicknesses and illnesses. These are the things that shape a healthy future. And the changes that you guys are each making in your households and in your own life are going to shape a healthy future for the next generations that come. And we have an opportunity to have next generations that don't have the burden of disease that we have today by learning from the root causes of what led to the burden of disease we see today.
Hmm. I really resonate with that. And speaking of just like really shifting your perspective, I recently was spending some time at Bela Farm. I think you know about it. It's Ryland from Kiss the Ground. His parents
I
founded
know,
it.
I know that one. Yes.
I spend quite a bit of time there with Truth, and it's so much fun. And we we actually ended up going there because they officiated Eric and I's wedding, so we're really close friends with them. And they told us that they know a family whose daughter, who she's 5 years old, and she has the same genetic condition as Truth. And we figured like it's super rare, they probably got it wrong. But over the weekend, we ended up meeting the woman and her daughter, and it was such an incredible experience. And we were exchanging our just our different experiences and just like talking about how we really are trying not to like place our own anxiety on our children because we want them to live their lives fully and not scare them about their condition, but really like educate them and really remember that they can do anything they set their minds to. And I was actually talking to Bridget, who's I think is she the director of health at M Clinic?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so happy you connected us, and working with her has been so much fun for our family. And I was just talking to her yesterday, and I was kind of updating her on all of it and sharing about how I I realized that like I was watching this documentary with Truth, and it was a helicopter skiing documentary, and it was just like for a few minutes, but he was so excited about it, and his natural state is to be really excited about extreme things like that, and it's so fun. But I find myself getting so nervous because I'm like, oh my gosh, if he wants to do this, like how is he going to do this without expending too much energy? And like I found myself going there in my mind like while we were watching it, and And I was telling Bridget about this, but I was like, I know that like if that's something he wants to do, I'm going to support him, and I'm always going to like remind him that he can do anything, and that's a conversation he'll have with you as his doctor and that sort of thing. And she was saying how like it's so funny how it's so incredible how safety is just, such a big deal in our society, and as it should be. But then she pointed out, like, look at as a just as a world at what we've done with putting safety like so ahead of everything else that we're willing to like not live anymore. And that analogy was so similar to like basically what, I could have done if I wasn't really aware of how easily I could influence my child. But it's like with the COVID thing, just how willing we were to just stay home in the name of safety, but really it's like in the name of fear. So I know you speak a lot about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, pertinent thing. And it's ironic because, of course, basically zero people under the age of 55 are dying globally. In the United States, the number's a little bit, detectable, but still, 99.99%, nothing. And then you go beyond below the age of 18, and now you're like, one in a billion, as kids of those ages are going to be affected. And yet we've shut down entire school systems, and we've made some very irrational decisions as a nation. And a lot of other countries haven't gone to those extremes, and have prioritized children's education and all of that. And so we've done, we have created the biggest fear paradigm in the world, certainly in the last 8 months, around this situation. But I think it's indicative of the fear paradigm we've built around the entire healthcare system as a whole in this country. We feel very disempowered as humans, let alone consumers. Like, imagine the multi-billion-dollar medical establishment slash industry medical complex that's been able to convince humans that they're incapable of a normal lifespan on their own. Like, when did we lose track of the fact that people have been living over the age of 100 for a very long time? And so it's amazing that we have outsourced our expectation of life and health on some chemical industry. It's dumbfounding. It's truly, I don't know how we fully bought into it so thoroughly, but I see cracks in that glass ceiling. And I think for all of the efforts towards control and mandated vaccines and all this movement that is happening, I think it's forcing a collapse of the system rather than a control of the system. I think I'm really convinced that we are moving towards a reawakening from this deep dream nightmare that we've created, and we're going to wake up to find out, oh yeah, we're human biology. That means we're resilient. We've been here for 200,000 years, and we weren't waiting for Western medicine to be created in the last 100 years to suddenly save us and create long life. Like, that's a ridiculous story that we created. How do we do that? How do we pump trillions of dollars into that? $3.8 trillion a year just in the United States being pumped into disease management now. That's such a broken system. That's such a thoroughly, ineffective, return on investment at this point. So when we wake up, the alternatives are going to be obvious and sitting right in front of us because we've spent 200,000 years with them.
I know I saw recently in your post that you had said like we spend somewhere like I think it's 4 times more on chronic disease management than military. Is that right?
Yeah, our entire military, homeland security, all that's around 700 billion, and so we spend 4 to 5 times more on chronic disease management annually than military. And we spend, a lot of people think that oil companies and energy sector is the wealthiest people. That's 1.2 trillion a year, and so we spend 3 times more on healthcare than we do all of our energy sector as a whole. That includes not just oil, but natural gas, electric, the whole thing. And so the tycoons that we now have at the pharmaceutical level have never been seen in history. This level of wealth, this level of consolidation of dollars into so few hands has literally never occurred in any industry, in any history of humanity. And so this is why we see their capacity for controlling the public narrative to the degree that they have in the last 8 months is fully out of the fact that they literally control the media. They own the media. They literally control the hospital systems. They literally own the hospital systems. They literally own the education system. They have since 1910. Something called the Flexner Report got filed in 1910 by the Rockefellers. Paid Dr. Flexner to write the report to Congress, and at that point they made illegal natural healing, and they made illegal homeopathy and acupuncture and naturopathy and chiropractic, all which were booming, very successful medical paradigms of the time. And
Wow.
when Rockefeller and the like got involved in the beginning of the pharmaceutical industry, they just decided they could control a lot more wealth if they could create a monopoly over the healthcare system in the form of allopathic medicine, or the MD becoming the only standard for medical care. And so that's when we outlawed a lot of all of these. And obviously we've spent another century trying to undo that harm of just that kind of control over it. So we're in a very precarious time as a nation because we're being driven into a state of massive expenditure on chronic disease, and loss of productivity is inherent. For every dollar we're spending in healthcare, we're losing probably $10 in productivity. And so the spiral on our entire economy is going to be opening itself up wider and wider in these coming years. And right now we're buoying up a failing U.S. economy by artificial economies such as that of the Wall Street, NASDAQ investment thing. So we make all of our money moving money around, lending money to other people, like not actually making anything. And so it's a scary thing when your largest sector of the U.S. economy by many fold, 3 times the size of the energy company, is now chemical companies taking care of chronically diseased people. You now have an economic incentive to keep the U.S. economy alive. You have an economic incentive to keep people sick, and in fact getting sicker, because it's the only mega industry that can buoy up a failing economy of this scale.
Did you know that 70 to 80% of your immune system resides in your gut lining? Ion Gut Health goes beyond probiotics to strengthen this barrier and balance your microbiome the natural way. This soil-derived supplement is scientifically proven to reinforce your first line of defense, keeping harmful foreign particles out of your bloodstream. Maintain a healthy immune system so that it can protect you when you need it the most. Don't just supplement. Support your immune system with Ion Gut Health. Learn more at ionbiome.com and receive 15% off using code THEFULLEST at checkout. I am Persian, so I'm really interested in saffron and other like botanicals that I grew up with, and that I know their healing benefits just from my culture. But I was reading this book all about saffron, and it mentioned in there that in the late 70s, the World Health Organization had a Health for All campaign. And they mentioned in there that basically the World Health Organization had realized that indigenous medicines and traditional medicines were more accessible for everyone in the world. And that was kind of their what their intention was, to bring health for all. And because pharmaceuticals were seen as still having these major side effects and not everyone wanted to adopt it, they had mentioned that really having the education around indigenous medicines was the best way. And I was reading this thinking like how incredible that they had this insight, but like that obviously didn't come into fruition. And then you had mentioned in your live the other day with RFK that really like in the 70s the trajectory of our health like really changed, and I think that was really had to do with like different chemicals like glyphosate and stuff, I believe, not necessarily big pharma, but I didn't know that it was as early as 1910. That was something I was going to ask you. I mean, it's been like this for an entire century.
Yeah, we're seeing the culmination of large economic interests increasingly narrowing the funnel of national healthcare system into fewer and fewer pockets. And you now see that accelerating as we see more and more hospital systems are now collapsing and turning into larger and larger conglomerates of hospital systems. We see insurance companies gobbling each other up, and so we're down to maybe half a dozen at the most hands that control the entire healthcare insurance industry. We're down to, probably a few dozen hospital systems that control the vast majority of American healthcare resources. And so it's just a scary, end result of capitalism gone amok. We don't have a true capitalistic system, and I don't know that we actually ever have. Capitalism is supposed to be a free market enterprise environment that breeds healthy competition to keep this kind of thing from happening. And I don't think we have evidence that in this area of agriculture, food systems, or human health, we've had a free economy in over a century, and I would probably argue probably over a millennia. I think that there's been oligarchs and royal families that have tried to control these things thousands of years back. So the control of these two things, food systems, water, natural resources, soil systems, and human health, are long time levers for control. And so the power that happens consolidated into an empire is frightening, and it reaps a huge humanitarian crisis. And you don't have to stop at the U.S. borders to find the American culture doing widespread damage. What's happening in South America right now, what's happening in Africa right now, in South Asia, in China itself. We've outsourced the most toxic agricultural practices in the world to create the cheapest possible commodities for our food system. The cheapest sugar, the cheapest meat, the cheapest sugar beet, the cheapest carrot. Like, all of these things are just destroying the ecosystems from which we extract, and we're not growing most of our food anymore. And in the same way, the chemical industry on the backside of energy and the rest do most of their harm abroad. And so we've outsourced the real pain and suffering. And as those systems collapse, we, as along with other empires, go rushing in to buy up their land and resources. China's bought the vast majority of the global resources in recent years in the form of water rights and soil and precious minerals. All of that's been bought up by China in Africa and South America. Even in the United States, we've sold a lot of our resources to China, and so we just are
What is
socially
someone
excited
doing with it though? Like, why are they like just to pollute it even more?
to just extract from it, right? And so it's an
Yeah.
extraction mentality. So now that they've extracted all the precious resources from China, they have to go broader. And so because we have not figured out how to build economies that are regenerative, and we only have extractive economies, the big rewards come through extraction, not regeneration. And so we need to reverse that model, and we need to quickly reverse that model. We're talking about 8 to 10 years. If we don't reverse the model, then we kind of look at an inevitable extinction event. And so we've got a very short amount of time to radically change the public narrative, the public awareness, and an understanding of how, as consumers, as American citizens, we are in the driver's seat of the consumption, and therefore we're also in the driver's seat of radical transformation and metamorphosis. And if we radically change our society, it will allow the rest of the world to either prevent the need to follow our destructive path, or help them more quickly reverse out of the path that they're already well down. So we have a responsibility as being the most consumptive and destructive empire in the last 30 years. I think China is now competing with us and may completely surpass any damage we've ever done. But it's our responsibility, I think, to start reversing this pattern. We are still China's primary importer, and so or export source from China. So we are still responsible for China's damage, and China's infliction, whatever they're inflicting on the world, is really due to our consumptive demand.
That it it goes in line with what I just watched The Devil We Know, a documentary about the teflon chemical and how that I think it's is it PFOAs that are found in 99% of the world's blood. I mean, people who aren't even consuming it, but it's in the teflon chemical is found in everything, even our clothing, like the Gore-Tex fabric that's used for, things like going out in nature and experiencing the snow and the rain and it just like really made me realize that, and obviously that's what this is all about, that we just don't have access to the basic necessities of health, like the clean air, soil, water, even before getting to food. And I'm just curious, like, how is it that, we talk about us being consumers and how we can make the change, but how is it that, I mean, obviously, first we need to get educated, but how can we, when it's in every single item? I mean, I love buying natural fabric and clothing made from natural fibers. And I even look at my clothes, like I was looking at it the other day, thinking, like, there's still like so many microplastic in the majority of my clothes that are like 98% wool, but they still have it in there. And obviously, I mean, I'm not saying that advocating for people to get crazy and go throw things out and all that. But I think it just really makes you realize that, we talk about like what's going on in Flint and that's going on across the world. And then we talk about like medical freedom and it's, such a privilege, but like everyone should have access to having choice and everyone should have access to clean air and soil and water. And that's why I love what you're doing too, because I think that actually, living in Orange County, I know Eric from Allegria Farms, and he used to personally deliver his farm boxes to my house, which was so amazing to have that experience of seeing his urban farming and what he's doing. And I noticed that you know about that, and I think you're working with him maybe in some capacity. So I think it starts with that. But I'm curious, like how can we change that when these industries are just so big and sourcing these things, it just seems so difficult.
Yeah, it's super exciting, really, is that there's actually a single solution to everything, whether we're talking about healthcare, agriculture, education, energy. The solution can be captured in a single word in that of decentralization. And so, as we decentralize business development or business resources or natural resource management, we become very powerful at solving all of the crises at hand. So, picture for a moment a neighborhood that has a education collective that is built in the outdoor environment, such that kids year round are either working in outdoor gardens or indoor greenhouses for a significant part of the day. Maybe to begin the morning, they spend a few 30 minutes weeding their section or harvesting some veggies and are turning that into the cafeteria. And then they go into some coursework in engineering around how to build greenhouse infrastructure for an hour. And in that, they're learning geometry and they're learning manual skills and they're learning systems thinking. And then, 2 hours later, they're after, some physical education or, recess outdoors, they're returning into lunch and they've got this regenerative, food on their plate. And it was grown largely from the gardens right there in their schoolyards. And that was the vision of Alice Waters with the Edible Schoolyard Project. And now we're working to partner with them on the Children and Farmers Project. She's developed a year-long menu for California public schools to be regeneratively sourced, and every meal throughout the month cycle is from a different nation and is informed by a different culture. And the placemat that it's served on is featuring the local architecture, the religion of the country, the socioeconomic factors within that country, and they're learning while they're eating, passively taking in what Turkish food feels like or tastes like, and what ingredients were grown in the garden this morning that went into that food. And so you can do that in the education system, but the same thing can be done in the engineering environment. The engineers need to be start learning in the context of the mechanisms by which bamboo builds strength through its tubular structure, and how that can be utilized for multi-story housing rather than steel girders and the like. And we can start to think regeneratively in our building materials, and we can stop designing squares and start to design in spirals and circles and spheres, arcs and the like, and branching patterns instead of angular 90-degree patterns. And in this, we'll create healthier environments, we'll create more resilient architecture that will sustain natural disasters more effectively, and will be more resilient to uh, ecologic integration. And those buildings can actually produce more food and clean water than they actually consume with those that live in those buildings. And a good example of this is being built right now in the center of Melbourne. One of my close colleagues and friends, Joost Bakker, is building what is aptly termed the greenhouse, and it's a 3-story or a 2-story inside, and the 3rd story is exterior. That is a 3-story residence. I think it's 3 bedrooms, and it houses a full family of 4, and it's got the capacity to grow more food than that family will consume in a year. It produces more clean water than will be consumed, and it produces more energy than it can consume, so electricity. And so, these are proven concepts that can be done at scale, that can be done as affordably as conventional things, which is the change. These things used to cost more than conventional. And so 20 years ago, when you showed a building like this, people would say, well, that's unsustainable, and nobody can afford that. Well, it's become affordable because of the innovation, because of the progress towards natural materials and all of this. And so there's going to be a future where all of this is possible. And so from engineering to education to healthcare, we can look into nature to find these templates for how we need to re-engineer everything. And when we do those in decentralized economic structures, where businesses no longer scale to be global monopolies, but instead scale to be stakeholders and idea seeds in companies all over the world. So if you think of a great idea, instead of trying to grow your idea into one company that then exports that all over the world, what if you became a stakeholder in 100 companies that were based in 100 different countries, and the board of directors on each of those companies were composed of local talent that was able to then re-engineer your idea or your product in the template of the local ecology, the local resources, the local economy, so that your product doesn't come in to disrupt and cause harm, but actually becomes a synergistic and well tuned part of the local economy, experience, ecology, and all of that. And so that's the way we change everything, is decentralize everything from education to business to engineering to architecture to energy sectors. That decentralization seems to solve everything. And it's really fun to think about that on the health level. Like, how fun is it going to be when your local your neighbor is the acupuncturist, and up the street there's an Ayurvedic nutritionist, and we learn to train our children into self autonomous community. That might be a 10 block area that has all of the resources it could possibly need. It's got the lawyers, it's got the healthcare providers, it's got the engineers, it's got the farmers, it's got the whole system there. And so there's a way for us to educate children into this, and if we showed them all of those options, that they could actually build multi-generational homes and lifestyles where they could grow up with their parents and grandparents and great grandparents again. I think a lot of people would select that.
Yeah.
Having to travel great distances to be one of 1,000 doctors in some small town that's overpopulated with doctors, and so you have to fly a bunch of patients into the middle of frozen Minnesota to go to the Mayo Clinic. It doesn't make sense. It's a stupid model on so many levels. So let's start building infrastructure in this decentralized fashion, and we'll solve for everything. So we'll get to that one way or the other. That's what happens when empires fail, is we tend to sneak back towards a feudalism kind of thing, where you get these small pods of autonomy starting to rebuild themselves. So I think one way or another we're going to get there. But if we did it proactively, we could stop a lot of human suffering in the pending collapse of the Western civilization empires.
It's so incredible because you speak with there's so much hope there, and I believe that if there's anyone that can do it, it's you. Like, I want you to have these conversations with Bill Gates. I want you to have these conversations with countries that are looking to industrialize and see the value and growing in this way. But then I also get so caught up in things like knowing that we just approved the use of glyphosate for another 13 years and like why that's happening, or the vaccine was just approved and it looks like the state of New York is looking to mandate it. So yeah, I think it is true that through this experience, so many people are waking up and so many people are seeing that it's not sustainable what we're doing. But I also think that we're still going through it at this moment, and it's just such an interesting time. So I'm curious, for people who are listening who are really big on medical freedom, I'm curious what you think before we get to that point, because that's the world I want to live in, and that's the community I want to live in with my son, where we trade these beautiful skills and we do that. I'm curious, like, where is that going to be? Is California going to follow with New York? Like, where are these pockets and where are these places in the near future that you think would support these alternative lifestyles?
Yeah, the last 6 months has definitely changed that landscape. But historically, looking at the last 5 years, Arizona has been one of the most forward-thinking states in the union as far as protecting alternative healthcare, for example, and so really lifting up integrative medicine as an important resource within it instead of trying to beat it down. And so they've passed some very progressive laws there in Arizona for health freedom that I think is intriguing. I'm very excited about what's happening in Texas right now as far as just a real rise in protection. I think Florida is going to continue to rise with its political protection over health freedom in the years to come. So I think those are a few hot spots. We'll have to see what happens in North Carolina, and we'll have to see what happens in West Virginia and some of these other states that are kind of off the beaten path right now. I think are going to be really huge targets for young families moving to in the coming years for the opportunities for health freedom. So that's a few bright points around the country, and there's certainly others.
What about Utah? If my Eric wants to move to Utah all the time, I was like, I'll ask Zach.
Yeah, no, I think Utah's likely to be okay spot for a period of time at least. I've been very disappointed by Colorado in the last few months. I really saw them as a progressive space, but again, this current fear paradigm is doing things to these local economies that nobody could have ever assumed. The control over these governors and local health officials is dumbfounding. So I would say Colorado's not your spot anymore. I think too much big money has rushed there, anyways. But anyway, I think Utah is an option. I think Nevada might be an option. I think that New Mexico is perhaps going to go in the right direction. They're kind of on a tipping point right now, not looking real good in the last couple of weeks. But as far as the short-term decisions they're making there, but I think that the population in New Mexico is likely to stand up. Um, I think that there's two different ways to think about it. What does the population want, and what is the government doing? Uh,
Yeah.
I think that what the population wants in Hawaii is really positive. I think what the government is doing in Hawaii right now is really negative. So, picking your spot, you have to ask those two questions: is this local government amenable to health freedom? If not, or if not yet, is there a population in that state that really wants health freedom to happen that you could team up with and mobilize and be part of a mobilization effort to change that local government to a more progressive, mindset towards health freedom?
It's so interesting to me because when I think about it, I think about the majority of people subscribing to the allopathic medicine paradigm. So it's so interesting that it's such a big deal to seek alternative treatments like homeopathy and acupuncture, and to want to go after maybe those practitioners or people looking for that. Because, I mean, what is the percentage of people that are even looking for that in the first place? Or do you think they're just like, who's scared of this being something that people seek?
Yeah, it's hard to pin down. I think fear is one of those very vague powers that gets it's hard to pin down the source of the fear. It's hard to predict all of the consequences to a fear paradigm of the scale that's being practiced right now. Humanity has never seen this scale of fear in history, I think, in regards to health. And so that the only exception to that I could think of would be like Europe in the middle of the Black Plague or something like, like, and that was where people were actually dying of a condition at extreme rates. We lost 15 to
Yeah.
20% of Western Europe at that time. So we're not losing that kind of people here. We're losing so few people in the United States. We lost far fewer people, from SARS-CoV-2 than we will from influenza or anything else. The whole COVID-19 is a syndrome. It's not a disease process. It doesn't happen because of the virus. The virus is long gone by the time people pass away with this more complex syndrome. And so the syndrome is not indicative of the virus. It's indicative of severe instability in the immunity and immune reactivity of a population. And so we've been sensitized to downstream, consequences that can be fatal in elderly and people with lots of high comorbid chronic disease, that can look like it came from a virus, perhaps, if the narrative is told correctly. But in New York City, for example, you've got 5,700 patients admitted to New York hospitals with a diagnosis of SARS-CoV-2, and the entire group, published in the Journal of American Medical Association, I think, in JAMA. But that publication demonstrated that as a population, they were non-febrile. They had no elevation in their white blood cell counts, no left shift in their white cell counts, suggesting a viral infection. So there's nothing suggesting that they actually were sick from a virus. And yet they had this, insanely high mortality rate in the ICUs of New York hospitals, 88% mortality if intubated. And there's no virus on earth that's ever had that low. Well, now suddenly we changed our practice and we realized we shouldn't intubate any of these people, and they're not due to a lack of oxygen. They're due to a lack of oxygen carrying capacity with downstream repercussions of inflammation and micro blood clots. And so once we started treating the inflammation and the blood clots, then people stopped dying from this condition. So we're not treating a virus anymore. We're treating dysfunction of immune system. And once you start to retarget that, your outcomes are better in healthcare systems and hospitals. But we should have, in realizing that, retold the story that people aren't dying from SARS-CoV-2 virus. People are dying from severe immune, instability and vulnerability.
And I know that you've mentioned that it has something to do with like the cyanide and PM 2.5 and the fires from Australia. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that, because it just makes so much sense. But then I also think about, yeah, I looked into it. It just makes so much sense to me. And then you talked a little bit about that having to do with blood clots as well, right? And like people on statins. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, there's a lengthy discussion on this on the Highwire. I think Highwire was the most thorough, rundown on this, but it took me an hour and 20 minutes. So I've got just a few minutes left with you here. But
Yeah.
the short version of it is that for long time, for decades, we've recognized that viruses that are respiratory borne, things like influenza and the like, including coronaviruses, bond to carbon toxins or carbon particulate in the air. And these small carbon particulate are caused by primarily the energy sector, but also transportation industry. So we end up with this, exhaust or waste product in the atmosphere that binds to viruses. And we start clumping viruses, then they can't interact with lung tissue in the same way that they should. And so you end up with a very artificial and dangerous delivery system for naturally occurring non-toxic viruses. And so the higher your PM 2.5 or carbon particulate level is, the more viral delivery you're going to get into the lung. And if you look at the map around the world of all the hotspots of high PM 2.5, you find exactly where we documented "quote unquote" death from COVID-19, when in fact they were dying from this pollution exposure in the air. And so that's northern Italy, pockets of Germany, the UK, New York, New Orleans, all these areas have very high PM 2.5, and it's usually a conglomeration of high amounts of oil and refineries and oil industries with nearby agricultural scenes. And nowhere is this more true than Hubei province in China, where this thing apparently all started. And so that's where you see the highest use of Roundup and glyphosate and herbicides, pesticides, and antibiotics. In pork industry, the highest amount of pork production in the whole world is right there in the Hubei area. And so you've got this massive toxicity of the agricultural industry combined with the highest amounts of PM 2.5 coming down from Beijing. And so you get this perfect transit for global distribution of viruses in very abnormal, non-biologically or non-natural ways. And then the receptors for those viruses that are now being delivered in clumped fashion rather than distributed fashion, uh, it, the receptors are upregulated by a couple of drugs, and those drugs are statin drugs and ACE inhibitors. And those two drugs are common to three different conditions: diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and end stage kidney disease. And those are the three comorbidities that had the very highest mortality with this pandemic, meaning that if you are on those two drugs, you've upregulated the receptor. And if you happen to be on those two drugs and living in an area of high PM 2.5, then your mortality is going to go really high. Fortunately, globally, the amount of people on statins and ACE inhibitors is quite low. In the United States, we're obviously many times more pharmaceuticalized than developing nations, and we see this huge vulnerability. And so, in the United States, we logged, if our accounting is even correct, and there's a lot of debate around that, obviously, but if our accounting for the number of deaths related to COVID-19 is correct, then we had about 20 to 25% of total global deaths, and we only have 4% of the global population. And so that means we had, sixfold or something the mortality rates than the rest of the world here in the country where we spend 7 times more than any other industrialized nation in healthcare, and yet we have, far worse outcomes. And if you look at, the health outcomes of the United States as a whole, where do we rank globally for health outcomes not related to pandemic, but cardiovascular disease, death on day one, any of these metrics, we rank 35th to 39th to 42nd in the world, depending on which group you count by. But we're dead last in all industrialized nations in our category. So of the 11 wealthiest countries, we're dead last. At 35th or 39th or 42nd in the world, doesn't matter which of those numbers you go by, but at 35th in the world, we rank behind war-torn countries like Eastern Bloc, Europe, and one of the few countries that is having worse outcomes on day one of life is Somalia right now. That's the only place you can find a higher day one mortality of infants than we currently have. We have the highest mortality rate in any industrialized nation in the country on day one. And so we have this horrific track record despite the $3.8 trillion that we're spending. And so our return on investment of that massive, the largest industry in the United States is horrible. We just don't have a return on investment. It seems to be making us sicker, not better. And this phenomenon of these drugs upregulating the receptors for viruses is a great example of these unseen side effects of pharmaceuticalizing the human body.
I know, and that's why when we talk about natural and alternative medicine, and some people, I think it can be a trigger to some people because I mentioned this earlier, like it's seen as such a privilege, but the only reason it's a privilege is because of the current healthcare paradigm. And if we could only just bring those alternative treatments to our most vulnerable population, then we would really shift things. But I almost feel like, especially in this current climate, it's such a heated conversation that even talking about it, I think, seen as, I mean, I wouldn't say like it's seen as racist, but just seen as, not, you know, I don't know the word, like caring or whatever. But I think it's conversations like this that really are eye opening and important for people to see. I mentioned I'm Iranian, so my family immigrated here from Iran. So Iran is one of the places that was hit hard with COVID, and that makes sense that these oil refineries are there, and so it makes so much sense with the toxins and PM 2.5 with them being hit hard there, and it reminds me, and I wanted to kind of talk about the microbiome anyways with you, of course, that when I was going around the farm, we were talking about just the soil health and this soil health in the Middle East. especially, and how it was just like the way that it's been managed there, and the way that that reflects just the people. And I feel like I can speak about this because especially it's my family, and they come from a time of war and a lot of unrest in their country. And I really recognize like the association of like the microbiome and that with the just the mindset of the people and the emotions. And I thought that was such an interesting way to talk about it. So I'm curious what you think, and if you've ever thought about that, or the difference between the gut health in these regions.
Yeah, you're spot on. The human immune system begins at the gut. Some 70 to 80% of the immune system by volume sits, right behind the microscopic, boundary of the gut lining. And so that immune system is, responsible for making some 80% of the antibodies to our environment and environmental threats. And so we don't think of the gut as, our immune system, but in fact it is, the vast majority of it. And so when you start to talk about gut health, you're really talking about immune health. And so when you start infiltrating a food system with poor soil management and sources of food that are grown in those poor nutrient soils, you're really talking about creating nutritional vulnerability. And I think this has happened throughout history. We have long cycles of malnutrition and starvation throughout the 200,000 years of human history, and it hasn't ended. We just had one of the largest famines in the last 100 years just happened in East Africa, and it hardly even got news. Like, everybody's so busy talking about the pandemic and all that, we weren't realizing that we have millions of people literally starving skeletons in Africa. We have so much food to distribute. We have so much corruption to keep that kind of horrific humanitarian crisis hidden. And so we've got a lot of work to do to understand that gut health begins with soil health, begins with regenerative food systems that are not vulnerable to drought and environmental changes in the same way that chemical farming makes us vulnerable. And so we really need to overcome this dependence on macroeconomic food systems and really start to develop microeconomics to support the 70% of the farming industry that feeds the world, which is our peasants. 70% of the world is fed by a peasant farmer today. And those peasant farmers are failing in their farms faster than any time in history. Suicide rates in farmers globally is going through the roof. This week alone, we see these massive marches in India of farmers that are protesting the encroachment of the lawyers that are now suing those Indian farmers, just as they did sue the U.S. farmers for patent infringement because they let their GMO seeds blow over all of these fields. And so it's just this really toxic, industry takeover of these developing economies. And I'm so excited to see, this mass, protest happening from farmers. I had the privilege of being on a panel with Dolores Huerta about a year ago. Dolores is one of the most successful, most decorated activists in the 20th century. She's been to the White House with every single administration since like Eisenhower. She
Wow.
was Cesar Chavez's right-hand woman in starting the Chicano farmers movement back in the 50s and 60s. And she's now in her 80s and is so well spoken, speaks so quickly and fast. She's so sharp, and she just blew away anything I could present. She was so much better. She just is the best activist on the planet still. And so sitting on the floor next to her chair at the end of it, my wife and I sitting there. She wanted to hear a little bit about our project with Farmers Footprint and all that, and she put her hand on my shoulder and said something like, "Well, I don't understand all of that complication and all that complicated stuff you're doing, but let me tell you one thing is that I think you're going in the right direction because I've never seen a successful revolution that didn't start with the farmers." And so
Wow.
when I see thousands and tens of thousands of farmers marching in India, that's the beginning of a successful revolution. When we march around streets in the United States demanding to defund our police, that's not the beginning of a successful revolution. We need to literally start at the soil. We need to start the revolution with our farmers. We don't win the game, protesting vaccines. We win the game protesting the abuses to minority farmers in the United States. And we by protesting the abuse of and taking away of lands, literally, blatant taking away of lands from indigenous peoples all over the world to fuel, private equity funds and big multinational corporations and all of this. And so we have to call a demand to humanitarian, responsibility and humanitarian sovereignty at these global levels to begin the revolution that we all want to see.
That's so beautiful. I'm so happy to hear about that. I didn't see that, so I don't know where people can go to see them marching, or if our media is covering it. But that sounds really promising, and I think that like the government in India, I know, are they like waking up to this as well? Like, are they listening to their people?
No, I think that's why the marches are happening.
Yeah.
They're not getting support from their local government that is, being, it's worked so successfully for Bayer and Monsanto and all these companies for decades. Is it takes such a small amount of money in the pockets of these governors. An example here on Hawaii, the governor who continues to approve unregulated, unapproved, toxic spraying of chemicals in Kauai, which is the Garden Isle, like the most beautiful island in the world, is now ground zero for Dow Chemical, Bayer. Five of the biggest companies in the world are spraying test chemicals that are the next generation of macro toxicity. These are unapproved, not safe, and yet they're being sprayed 100 feet from public school fence lines and stuff like this. And kids are
Yeah.
literally, drop. If you want to see a deep dive on this, the film is called Poisoning Paradise. That's a film to watch to kind of get a sense of just the power of these chemical industries
Wow.
around this thing. And they gave the local mayor there $7,000 in his campaign to do this. And so it's like 7 grand, like 7,000 is what bought the poisoning of this island. And
Oh my.
so when you look at India, it's that kind of economics. For $700, for $7,000, they can buy, government officials to approve these things. And so the people are not getting supported by their local and regional governments in India right now. But I think this revolution, India has proven that grassroots movements can change their democracy. And so I'm encouraged by the Indian, democratic process, as corrupt as it is, that they actually have had revolutionary things passed in the past. So I think if a farm
Yeah.
revolution is going to happen, it could happen in India.
Well, I thought that they were like in some lawsuit with the Gates Foundation, but I don't know.
Well,
I
yeah, they are actually, and they successfully actually banned the Gates Foundation vaccine trials from India a couple years ago because of the amount of paralysis that was happening in their children that was under these, vaccine trials that were, it turns out had never been proven to be safe, and all of these paralyzed children, over 1,200, I think it was, paralyzed children in a very short period of time, just a few months. And it turned out a vaccine that had already proven to cause meningitis and paralysis in South America, and then they moved it to India. So it's just this corruption runs so deep, and but India has been progressive in kicking out the WHO and the Gates Foundation and all of that. And I think agriculture is the last bastion of the chemical industries there that India needs to step up and really claim sovereignty and protect their people against the chemical industry.
Yeah, okay, so I'm curious because when I look up information on India or Gates Foundation and the lawsuit and stuff like that, like all of everything's so censored, and it's so tough to find like a source that's really speaking on this. So is there anywhere that you look in particular?
Yeah, I mean, BBC's covering the Indian situation really well right now. So if you look up BBC and search for the
Yeah.
farm protests happening there, that you'll get some good coverage there. Al Jazeera is doing a pretty good job of covering some of this content. So there's definitely some international, contingents there. But the Human Resiliency Fund, maybe the fund that you were referring to earlier, is something that I've just launched. And we are partnering with, one of the things that we're going to be funding is a group of independent journalists with a group called the Mongabay Foundation, and mongabay.org is their website. I'll send you that. But, their group funds independent journalists to do deep dives on humanitarian crises or whatever it is around the world to figure out what's really going on. So we're going to be funding up a dozen independent journalists through the Human Resiliency Fund to tell a deeper story on what's really happening in China, what's really happening in the vaccine industry, what's really happening around the the suppression of the 30 years of science to show us that the adaptive immune system and antibodies have absolutely nothing to do with the way in which we stay in balance with viruses. And so, we're 30 years behind at least, and we're trusting 100-year-old science on this whole vaccine thing. And so we'll be setting independent journalists off on that mission to tell the deeper stories around that. So Human Resiliency Fund is going to be an exciting, narrative that's coming out of funding science labs, public resources. We'll be putting in growing regenerative 12-month, round the year growing systems into urban food deserts that were hit hard by COVID in the United States. We're going to have a trial in a prison, a First Nations reservation, a school district, and so we're going to put these regenerative food systems into these threatened and vulnerable populations. A nursing home will be one of the targets. And so we'll put these growing systems in place to show the immediate impact of good soil, good food on the innate immune system as the gut is restored, and resilience in those communities to things like the influenza and coronavirus pandemics. So we're very excited about that fund. It's big enough pool of dollars to really do some really big work and leveraging NGOs and other multinational groups of money to retarget their money towards more effective ways of telling the story of human immunity than vaccines.
And I know that you mentioned your rate. Is it you've already raised 100 million, or you're looking to raise?
We're raising 100 million. We just opened up fundraising just a week ago, and we've already got the first big commitments already on the way. So we're very excited to be moving towards that target in 2021 to do that. And so if anybody listening knows family offices or foundations that would be interested in telling a global story on the human immune system that's up to date with the last 30 years of science around the microbiome, the virome, and the innate immune system, if that sounds like an exciting thing for that, it'd be limited in general to high net
Yeah.
individuals that are SEC unified. So we actually aren't SEC certified to take small donations. So we have to have net worths of north of $1 million in these family foundations, all that to justify our legal ability to take money. But it's philanthropic, so it's all tax deductible donations, and that can be important at the end of the year. So if there's people listening who are part of family foundations or funds that'd be interested in supporting at the end of the year to help with your tax deductible impact giving at the end of the year, we'd be happy to entertain those discussions there.
And you're doing all this, and you're doing Ion Biome, you have M Clinic, and you also, I mean, your kids are grown up, but how many kids do you have? Do you have 2 or?
Yeah, just 2 kids right now, and they're great. I've got my son is an engineer in Virginia, and my daughter's in performing arts and animal care. She during the day she runs a dog care project in New York City, and then she started her own theater company called New York City Street Theater during COVID, and they're doing
All
free
that.
free street theater for people in the subway systems and all of that around the city. And so check out nycstreettheater.com nycstreettheater.com if you live in the city there. It's a pretty amazing showcase of Broadway talent happening right on the streets of New York to give some good news to New Yorkers and bring a little bit of the warmth of New York City back in a time where much of that has been stripped away from that city.
I looked into what she's up to, and it looks so incredible. I've watched some of her videos, and I like the way that they're doing it too. I mean, you can't even tell that they're wearing masks. It's like a shield that they
Yeah.
have a microphone on, and it's super cool. You can feel at least like, when you look at them, it still feels like pure human connection, and it looks so wonderful. And I was so curious. Like, I think she mentioned maybe on her website somewhere, did you mention, was she homeschooled? Were your children homeschooled?
Yeah, they were homeschooled all the way through.
That's incredible. And this is, I mean, before you got into like alternative care and stuff, right? I mean, you were like a full-on allopathic doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I was in transition during those years for sure, and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, really, you know, anybody who's homeschooled for a long time finds out that the word homeschooling only really goes on for a couple of years in those earliest years, and then it turns into self-schooling, right? And so, if you give kids enough space to discover their passions, they're going to self-educate. And both my kids kind of identified their passion areas of engineering and performing arts, by the time they were 10 or 12 years old. And so we allowed them to really, focus their attention towards their areas of interest and put them in a large homeschool co-op, which allowed them to have external teachers outside of the home in these homeschool co-op environments. And then we graduated them from homeschool high school at 14 so they could go into the community college and finish out some associate degrees in the next 3 years. So they both finished their community college things at 17 and moved into their university programs at 17 from there with transferable credits. So I think, to encourage everybody who's being forced to homeschool right now, think about, reinventing that into self-schooling for your kids and see if you can really nurture their passion points. Because if you do, it's truly unbelievable how self-directed learning is so effective. They don't forget what they've self-learned. They will build a very successful pathway very early if you let them really fully pursue their things. And if your kid just does not like math, and that was my daughter, she couldn't stand it. She swore she would never take another math class past fifth grade, and so we didn't force her to. And she ended up in a performing arts program at the American Musical Drama Academy on Broadway that couldn't have cared less if she hadn't had math in 10 years. Like, they didn't. I don't think any of her professors know how to do multiplication. I don't know. It's like it is such an extreme creative environment. They couldn't care less. And so know that your child has a very, incredible arc of career if you let them find their passions. If you force them into, the paradigm of Western education, they're going to be on a very long journey to find them way through that to go find a passion on the other side of it. So let the passions drive on the front end would be my recommendation after seeing those kids do what they've done. Is just try to stay out of the way, create a safe bubble, and try to create creative resources, and always challenge the habits of the week by expanding the horizon with travel or with new environments. Trips to the mountains is all it takes on a weekend, and don't forget to get them out in nature. Just as my mom took the opportunity to build a lifestyle around our family that would keep us in touch with healthy foods and healthy environments. Do that with your kids and your homeschooling efforts, and you'll find great success.
I love that. That's so inspiring, especially for now, whether it's people that are just doing it at home because of COVID, or people that are just inspired to take their kids out of the system and start new traditions. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us a little bit more about you and what you're up to. Thank you so much, Dr. Zach.
You're so welcome. Blessings on you, Nikki, and to your entire audience. And I hope that the rest of the 2020 treats you all very well as we prepare for a revolution of consciousness, at least in 2021.